Ms. Ross, you may begin.
Thank you, and welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of our conference on 50 years of U.S.-China relations. I'm Madeline Ross with the U.S.-China Education Trust. This webinar is the 16th gathering of the American Studies Network, a group of more than 50 universities in China. It brings together scholars from China and the United States to share research and discuss topics in U.S.-China relations and American studies. The gathering normally takes place at a host university in China, but this year, after an unexpected gap of several years, it's been condensed into a virtual webinar for reasons with which we are all too familiar. The first session began approximately 12 hours ago and featured a dozen top scholars in dialogue about U.S.-China cooperation on climate change, about societal changes and their impact on U.S.-China relations, and generally about the ups and downs of the relationship over 50 years. There were moments of optimism and pessimism, but most of all, it was a chance to share ideas about subjects that concern and affect all of us. Talking won't necessarily solve the problems, but it will lower the risk of misunderstanding and miscalculation, and that is one of our main goals. Today, we have a full program with 2 additional panels and a moderated discussion. Please remember that this webinar is off the record. We will prepare a final report and post highlights on the U.S.-China Education Trust website next month. Thank you for spending part of your weekend with this panel, with this conference, wherever you are. And let's get started. It's now my distinct pleasure to turn the microphone over to the moderator of our first panel, Dr. Robert Kapp.
Thank you, Madeline, and good morning, everyone on both sides of the Pacific. And thanks for spending time with us on this program. It's difficult sometimes to see clearly when one is in the midst of rapidly changing events, but that's what we're trying to do in this program. And one aspect of the U.S.-China relationship, which requires that quieter and longer term view, is the economic relationship between the two countries. We have this morning three tremendous panelists to talk with us. And since their biographies are in your conference program materials, I will not discuss them at great length. But Wang Yong is a friend of more than 30 years. I've known him since I was running the China Business Council in Washington, D.C., and he was a young scholar working on China's pending entry into the WTO. And we're going to start with Professor Wang Yong of Beijing University. Wang Yong.
Thank you, Bob. I think first of all, I'd like to thank the U.S.-China Education Trust and the China University Foreign Affairs. Also, thank Bob's invitation for this great panel. I think it's a very important topic, and I'd like to present my views and thoughts on the U.S.-China relations in the last 50 years from the economic and trade relationship perspective. I think the Nixon's visit to China, they opened the door of the U.S.-China relations, has changed the mood and the styles of the next 50 years international relations. The first point I'd like to share is the realism that began to dominate the U.S.-China relations. The Nixon's visit not only ended the high tension, the highly confrontational relationship between the two countries. It's a very, the strange period for the two the great nations didn't have diplomatic relations for more than 20 years. U.S. imposed full-scale economic sanctions and boycott against China. I think now the most important part of the Nixon visit is to help us to coming back to a more rational, de-ideological, the new era. Later the relationship based on the common sense of the national interest, the fully economic cooperation and people-to-people exchanges. So I think that is a very important lessons we can learn from this great effort of opening the U.S.-China relations. The second point I would like to share with friends here is that the security relations and economic relations work together to help expand and deepen U.S.-China relations. At the beginning, economic cooperations, the trade interests, also didn't belong to the part of the U.S.-China, reconciliations. Right? So there is a security, the considerations driving the beginning and opening up of the relationship. But in the end, we have find the growth of economic and trade relations between two countries has become one of the most driving force behind the U.S.-China relations, especially since the 1991. That is the common security interests of the two countries has declined, but the trade economic relations has coming up to become the major driving force between the United States and China, including the most important development at that 10 point, right? So that is the U.S.-China, the United States stimulated the economic globalization, and China made a positive response, embraced the U.S.-led economic globalizations, and the China participation in the decision in International Division of Labor, and China's efforts of joining the WTO. All these things had put the economic relations as a part of the cornerstone of the U.S.-China relations, which has helped to stabilize the U.S.-China relations in the first 10 years after the end of the Cold War. The third point I'd like to mention is that the U.S.-China relations of today has been the result and the consequences of economic globalizations. The economic globalization has changed U.S.-China relations and regional and international relations in the last 30 years. U.S.-China has become more comprehensive, the common interest-based relationship, right? So that is the contributions of the globalizations, but also the changed the regional, the Asia-Pacific regional relations, the structures, right? So I think that is economic interdependence, not only among the U.S.-China, there's two the great economy, but also among all the Asia-Pacific countries, right? So has become the most important political and political foundations of the stability and peace and the prosperities of the region in the last 40 years. Right? So China has become the most important trading partners of most all the countries and economies in Asia Pacific. They demonstrate the strong will not to be sided with either China or the United States, right? So that it can become a peaceful and a stabilizing force, okay, for the region's the peace and the stability. The fourth point, I think the U.S., there are a lot of people is worried about and start to be worried about the U.S.-China relationship, the politically hostile atmosphere behind the two countries, partially in the United States. I would like to make the argument like that the U.S.-China policy has been based on the two misunderstanding or misassumptions. One is in the trade relations. I think the China the benefits and the U.S. has been taken advantage of. In the values and ideologies, okay, that is U.S.-China has departed from each other, has taken a very different paths. So I think there's two kind of misperception and misjudgment as driving the U.S.-China into this, the vicious cycle. For the first part, I think a lot of people in our conference, I believe, has presented their excellent ideas about the ideology and the political system, the reasons for the U.S.-China relations. I'll be focused on the economic the side of the U.S.-China relations. How how wrong such a kind of misperceptions can be in the reshaping the U.S.-China relations. Okay, there is no doubt that is the trade balance exists between U.S.-China, and that is mainly the consequences of the economic globalization and international division of labor. So the examples of the Apple, the mobile phone, has been cited quite often. Right, the U.S. company, the Apple, has captures about 60% of the profit. The Chinese enterprises, Chinese company, the Chinese workers, they earned only 6% of the profits. But all the exports of the Apple, the phones, exported to the United States have been counted as the value of China's exports to the United States. Right? So that is why. So I think that is no reasons to believe American workers will they like to come back to the taken the jobs, retake the jobs which has done by the Chinese workers in the Chinese histories. Right, so that is why we need the new methodology for calculating the bilateral trade. Right, another examples. Right, so that is 30 years trade. Trade data. Among the across the Pacific sides. That is the U.S. and East Asia trade relationship, right? So if we compare with the data of 1990 with the data of the trade data of today, we have found that there's no substantial change in this term of trade balance across the Pacific Rim. Even the United States side has a little bit decreased its trade deficit. So that means in the last 30 years, China has, what China has replaced is in expanding the exports to the United States is just to replace the exports from the other economy of East Asia, rather than to replace the domestic manufacturing of the United States.
Professor Wang, I'm going to interrupt just long enough to say that we've only got a couple of minutes left and hope that you can begin to conclude and then continue your remarks in the discussion that follows. Okay. Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you. Yeah. Thank you for reminding that. So I think that is, I would like to say, if we combine the stories of investment, I would like to say the U.S.-China has lost a great opportunity to let the bilateral investment to help the balance the economic relations between the countries. Right? So China's appreciate American direct investment and investment from other countries in China, which has created jobs. Right, so I think in starting after the 2008, the global financial crisis. Right? So that is so the Chinese company just started started investment in the United States, such as Hell, the Fuyao Class, Huawei, and TikTok. Right? So that is 2016. It can be regarded as historic year because in this year, the volume of China's investment in the United States it is surpassed that the U.S. Investment in China. But very unfortunately, because of the political relationship and in the tariff war, has prevented the United States and have been Chinese company would have created great jobs in the United States. The last part I would like to, as the conclusion of my remark, is how can the economic relations help U.S.-China come back to the track, the normal track. I would like to make suggestions such as, the U.S.-China should conduct a more effective communications to reconfirm the common interests of the two countries, reconfirm the common grounds, even in the values and the ideologies, and to find the common grounds in regional and international security structure. The number two is the two countries should let the economic relations continue to play a stabilizer of the U.S.-China relations, because the trade and economic and investment is the most easy part of the U.S.-China relations. Thirdly, the U.S. elites should be disclose the truths about the U.S.-China economic relations in more convincible way. Okay, that is, the trade with China is not the cause, it's not the problem. Cause the different the problems of the United States. So I think that is very important to be disclosed such things in the honest way. So the China should not become the scapegoat of the U.S. The domestic problem and crisis, especially the widening wealth gap. The number four, that is U.S.-China should conduct the dialogue to ensure each other the security, the supply chain, not to weaponize the global supply chain. So I think that is very important. So I think that means the U.S. should continue to let the Huawei and ZTE, the Chinese company, to have the access of semiconductor products produced by American company, because that benefits American economy. On the other hand, China should. Okay, yes.
I'm sorry.
Last words. There is two countries should resume the BIT talk, and China has sent very clear the signals to the United States and international community to be more open the economy. Right, so China has officially applied for the CPTPP, applied for for the data. Thank you very much, Bob.
Those are great remarks, and I want to come back to the BIT thing when we get into our discussion. Friends, if you have questions, don't forget to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I'll try to scroll through those as the meeting goes on and call on one or two of you if there's time. But now we turn to Arthur Krober, another longstanding friend of mine and one of America's most respected observers of and analysts of the Chinese economy, both as a journalist over many years and as the leader of one of the most prominent American consulting firms analyzing and forecasting on the Chinese economy. Arthur's coming to us from New York. The floor is yours, Arthur. Once you unmute.
Thank you very much, Bob, and thank you, Madeline, for allowing me to participate in such distinguished company. I'm just going to make a couple of very brief comments here. I think Professor Wong has done a terrific job of sketching out a lot of the details of the U.S.-China economic relationship over the last 50 years and where we might go from here. Since this is to commemorate the move 50 years ago by President Nixon to push towards normalization with China, I thought I would reflect on the ways in which the economic relationship between the U.S. and China is not something that has evolved organically as the result of impersonal forces, but has really depended on specific creative diplomacy on both sides, and is thus the product of strong, intentional, patient effort over many years. And unfortunately, I think this is going to lead me to a fairly pessimistic conclusion about where we are today. But if you go back to 1972, I think the key fact is that both President Nixon and Chairman Mao decided that they were going to put quite significant ideological and geopolitical concerns to one side in the service of a shared interest. And that was basically a security interest at that point. Both countries had a shared interest in creating bulwarks against the Soviet Union that they both found threatening in different ways. And so that required a lot of creative diplomacy to get over the ideological barriers, but they succeeded. And then similarly, if you look in the 1980s, after Deng Xiaoping started the process of economic reform in China, there was a decision made on both sides that, again, despite the ideological and geopolitical tensions that might exist between the US and China, that there was a strong shared interest in integrating China into the global economic order. And the signal achievement of this, obviously, was China's WTO accession in 2001, which took 15 years of extraordinarily complicated, patient, creative diplomacy across several US administrations and several groups of Chinese leaders. And again, this was motivated by the sense that whatever their differences, the US and China both had a lot to gain by China becoming a more full participant in the global economic system, that this would create enormous prosperity, not only in China, but in the world as a whole, and that prosperity would undergird peace and stability. And I think if you look at these two things, and I would also stress that it was not just a matter of WTO accession, there were a lot of other ancillary economic engagements, both before the WTO entry and after, which resulted by the 2010s, the United States and China had over 100 dialogues or interactions at various levels of government, from the very top down to the working level, the majority of which had at least some significant economic component. So it was not just simply that the two countries flipped a switch, China joined the WTO, and countries went on their way. There was deep engagement at many levels that required a lot of work and fine-tuning and calibration of the economic relationship. And I think the first observation I would make, looking back on this now, is that in both countries, the United States and China, the spectacular success of this creative diplomacy is deeply underrated. In the United States, we've come to blame China for all kinds of economic and other problems that are really more the result of technological change and failures of US domestic policy. In China, there has been frankly, a toxic narrative that the United States is somehow involved in a conspiracy to keep China down and constrain its economic growth, when the entire history of the last 50 years argues against that the US has done what no other great power in history has done. It has invested enormous energy, both at the business level and at the diplomatic level, to ensure the prosperity and success of a country with a very different political system and with very different geopolitical interests. So I think both sides have fallen prey to false narratives about how this enormous success story has somehow created harm. And both sides are now trapped in these narratives and find it very difficult to get out. And that's really my sort of pessimistic conclusion right here, is if we look today, where these 100 dialogues that I've talked about have basically all been eliminated, the levels of communication between the two countries are as low as they've ever been in the last 50 years. How do we get out of this? How do we move to a more productive place? And I think the basic problem is, if you look at the success of the past, both the success of the Nixon initiative in 1972 and the subsequent economic integration initiative, they required both countries, leaders in both countries, to define a common shared interest. And over many, many difficulties, the two countries were able to work together to achieve that shared interest, and they succeeded. And it was not easy. It took 8 years from Kissinger's original visit to China to normalization of relationship. It took 15 years of very difficult negotiations to get China into the WTO. Patience is definitely required, but in order for patience to be exercised, you have to have a clear shared objective. And frankly, I do not see either in China or in the United States today any leader who is willing to take responsibility for defining a clear shared objective of the two countries, or is willing to explain to his or her population the necessary compromises and costs that will be required to achieve this benefit. So I would like to suggest that we have a stronger basis for moving forward. Unfortunately, I think it's very problematic at the moment, and the best I can suggest is that because the world is now much more complicated, it's not just a US-China bilateral thing. I think each country needs to work as best it can with the partners that it has, and then hopefully over time there will emerge some opportunities for dialogue between the two great countries. But it requires visionary leadership, it requires a sense of shared interests, and it requires a commitment to patient, difficult, hard diplomacy over the long run to achieve a good outcome. And I really don't see those conditions very much in place at the moment. So sorry to leave you on a downer, Bob, but I'll pass it back to you, and perhaps Li Wei will
Thank
offer
you,
some
Arthur.
more hope.
Thanks, Arthur. That was articulate on many points, including the fact that we all need to think not only about the other guy's country, but about our own country, something which I think is sometimes not as fully developed in the dialogues that we do have between the United States and China as we ought to. I'm looking to see whether Professor Li Wei of Renda, I should say Li Wei, is on the call. Trenton, can you tell me whether, oh, there's Professor Li, very good. It's a pleasure to call on Professor Li Wei of Renda, whose brief biography in your materials is much too brief. He is extraordinarily prolific. I have been looking at some of his lists of writings, and it is really an amazing display. He is a Fudan product, and originally from central China, and has risen to great prominence now in the study of international relations, and particularly the Sino-American relationship. Li Wei, you've heard now from Wang Yung and from Arthur, and we look forward to your thoughts of your own and your comments on what they had to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Today, I'm going to share 3 points of my view with you on the China-US economic relations. My responses to the 2 speakers are also included in my comments. First of all, one of the important facts that we should realize is that China and the US are both beneficiaries from our bilateral economic engagement. It is definitely not a zero-sum game, so which has been emphasized by Mr. Wang Yong's presentation. In the past 40 years, the US economy has increased almost 10 times. I share with the similar ideas with Professor Wang that although the Chinese economy has grown faster than the US from a very low point in the past 4 decades, it has mainly taken up the share of Japan's and the EU's share in the world. In the presentation, Mr. Wang used other countries. So in my view, the other countries is Japan and the EU and the European Union countries. The US has remained the leading and the biggest economy in the world, which means it is in fact a win-win game for the US and China, not China wins twice. More than that, China's openness and reform since 1979 helped the US win the Cold War with Soviet Union. Both speakers have talked about this. Particularly Mr. Kroeber has said in confronting Soviet Union, the China and the US has the shared interest. That's true. Although because one of the most important countries, China's transition from a planned economy to a market economy has enhanced America's soft power as the successful economic transition of China increased the attractiveness of the ideas of the free market in the whole world. The second point of mine is we should try to understand the US unsatisfaction with the current economic relations. Although the United States has also benefited very much from the bilateral relations, the benefits distribution is unequal domestically. The globalization produces winners and losers. In US, the Silicon Valley and Wall Street has got the most benefits from China-US economic relations. The problem is the US democratic system cannot efficiently make redistribution. Actually, in China, we also have some losers. For example, the peasants in the countryside and the workers in the state-owned enterprises. Comparatively, China has stronger state capacity and more domestic policy tools to protect and compensate the losers. In the past, particularly after the end of the Cold War, the US foreign policy was mainly driven by the business, and the Washington consensus has been the dominant ideas of the US. But now, from my understanding, the highlights of the US foreign policy have shifted from the interest of business to that of the middle class, as the two parties are competing for the latter's votes. That's why Biden administration has brought about a new slogan, the so-called middle class diplomacy. So in my view, US government want to make US of the China-US economic relations as an excuse to solve the domestic problems. The last point, given the fact that the US is unsatisfactory with the bilateral economic relations, China should do more. So I really appreciate Mr. Kroeber's ideas, the creative diplomacy. China also leads creative diplomacy. Both speakers mentioned China's entry into WTO. However, the liberal international order based on WTO is shaky. I agree with Secretary Blinken that no country on earth has benefited more from the liberal order than China. Therefore, China should take strong actions to defend it. Actions should include more market access, reducing more barriers, no matter tariffs or no tariffs. If China keeps opening, I don't believe the US business will and is able to decouple with the Chinese market, which is the largest one in the world. Although Mr. Kroeber expressed pessimist views on the future of China-US, but from the Chinese side, I would like to conclude that China cannot change the US, but China can change itself. Through changing itself, China can change the US. That's it. Thank you, Bob.
Well, that was a fascinating presentation, Li Wei, and I thank you very, very much for that. I want to give Arthur and Wang Yung a chance to re-enter the conversation for at least for a little while before we turn to Q&A, to see whether they have any comments on each other's thoughts or on your very interesting commentary, Li Wei. Arthur, any further comments you want to add into this?
Yeah, I would just like to, I was very glad that Professor Lee was able to temper my pessimism with a much more optimistic point of
So
view.
was
And
I, Arthur. So
I
was I.
would just, I would just like to endorse that. And I think he's put his finger on something that is really critical, which is that a lot of people, you know, including myself, who've been studying China for a long time, have grown concerned in recent years that China is less committed than it has been in the past to a path to a more liberal and open economy. There have certainly been forces in China working the opposite direction for the last several years. And I agree entirely that at a point when bilateral discussion seems not a very productive channel, unilateral action can have a big impact. And I think particularly in China, since there is a significant gaps between China's economic organization in terms of how marketized it is and so forth, and barriers to foreign trade and investment. The more that those can be liberalized, the more that China can be perceived as a fully good faith actor in this, and the more that I think would tend to erode the kinds of negative views that you have in the United States. So I would just like, I would fully endorse Professor Lee's point there that one pathway here is for a renewed and fairly aggressive path of liberalization. And most of the studies on China's long-term economic growth, I think very clearly point to the fact that China, if it wants to sustain high growth, it's going to have to do those reforms. And if it fails to do that, it will be bad purely on China's own terms. So 100% endorsement of Professor Lee's wise remarks there. Thank you.
Thanks, Arthur. Wang Yong, any further thoughts on what Professor Li Wei had to say, or Arthur, or additions from your own mind?
Yes, thank you, Bob. We had two excellent presentations from Arthur, from the Li Wei. Yeah, I think because of the time limit, just came to Arthur's the one point, right? The world is not just about China and the United States, right? Yeah. So I think the world has changed, right? So I think especially the rise, the economic rise of the whole Asia. I said, okay, China has become the major trading partners of all these economies in Asia Pacific, right? They would like to keep the close relationship with both sides. So I think that is where they will be not advised to for these countries to pick side. So and that is a point related to this. And if the United States is to be engaged too much resources in containment of China, right? Contains China increasing the influence, they will take the risk, the wasting resources and to handle the domestic problems. Okay, and to Li Wei's, Professor Li Wei's point, I think that is he made a very good view, on the WTO implications to China and what China have to help to maintain the rule-based international system, right? So, so I think China, very difficult to change the United States, but China can change itself. I 100% agree with that. China should do more, to ensure the United States and other countries and international community, right? Not only in the continuing the lines of opening up, but also in the ideology and political lines, right? So China can definitely do more on this. Thank you, Bob.
Well, we're off to a great start here, and we could continue at length, but I do want to give some of the friends in the viewing audience, as we say, a chance to have their thoughts considered. So let me just read one to you now. And as you talk about that one, I'll be looking at other questions on the list here. The first question that came in is on technology and reads, how will the cooperation in cutting edge technology industry between the US and China, how will it be in the future? What should two countries do to promote the cooperation in scientific and technological research? And I will ask any one of you to start. I think Arthur looks like he's preparing to start.
Yeah, I'll make a quick comment on that.
Yeah, let's be very short on these.
Yeah, at the government to government level, I don't really see much scope because I think clearly technology is now seen in both countries as a zero-sum game, basically, and so there's politically no space for that. But a lot of technological cooperation and joint development occurs, not via governments, obviously, but by the at the business level. There's still enormous U.S. business presence in China, and this is increasingly focused on R&D and these higher level activities. So I would say two things here. One is that China needs to Li Wei's point, make sure that it is maintaining a progressively more open environment so that companies see that they have a long-term future in China and can make those kinds of investments in joint technological development. And then I think on the US side, the key thing to watch is that there's increasing political support for restrictions on outbound direct investment, which would restrict the ability of private companies to make investments in China potentially. And I think that is basically a fairly dangerous thing, and that this should be opposed. I don't think it serves a legitimate national security interest. So within the US, I think what can be done is negative, basically, to prevent those kinds of restrictions from being imposed.
Thank you, Arthur. Li Wei or Wang Yong, any thoughts?
I would like to. Okay, Mr. Wang, you first.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think the most important things, okay, to try to minimize the influence of politics in the US-China technology relations. I just share the other point, right? So let the company, the private sector, to decide what they can do, because they will take care of their interests. Right now, very unfortunately, in the realms of science and technology, there is too much domestic politics and too much, the geopolitics.
Thank you, Li Wei.
Okay, I would like to make some responses to the last question. What China can do more? Actually, from my side, from my understanding, China has done very much in the past 2 years. For example, we finished the BIT with European Union, and we have finished the negotiation of the RCEP, and also we are applying for the for the membership of the CPTPP. What's the we can do more? Include and also we can lower the further lower the tariff, and also we can remove more the limits of the on the investments. So I think China can be more open. Yes, that's all.
Thank you. Let me turn to one other question that came in. I just have to do some clicking here. An anonymous writer writes, if patience is required for both sides to define common shared interests, these defensive measures in trade and economy and security need to dial down a few notch, but there is no sign so far. Time is on whose side? And I would add to that a little bit of something that I keep thinking about. If you were to imagine that the way that the two sides, the only way the two sides can begin to de-escalate from their economic and commercial conflicts is through a very gradual, step-by-step, almost reciprocal lowering the tensions. What are some of the, what might be some of the early steps that either country could take that would at least slow the deepening momentum toward further conflict and begin to reduce the economic levels of tension between the two sides? What might either side do step by step? I think that relates to the question the person has asked here. Any thoughts?
Yeah, that's very difficult. So first of all, I mean, I think as a matter of fact, certainly what you hear people in the US administration say is that basically whenever they approach the Chinese side with some kind of effort to work jointly in some small way, in the service of this kind of de-escalation, they basically hit a brick wall, right? So I think there's a real, and the Chinese perspective on this is that in order to do small things, you first have to recalibrate the overall relationship and make it less hostile. So I think one of the problems that you have right now is there's a completely different conceptual approach on the US side and the Chinese side, which makes it very, very difficult for these things to happen. My view, frankly, is that what both sides need is kind of a cooling off period, in which the best that we can hope is that nothing happens in the bilateral relationship, and both sides can start to formulate more realistic views about what is achievable and what they need to do domestically. And then after some period of time, maybe they can find a way back in. But I think certainly in Washington, the political atmosphere is hostile to anything that would be seen to accommodating China. And frankly, in China, the political narrative is largely about US containment and so forth, and that makes it very difficult for China to move. So I think basically we're in a situation where both sides need to retreat to their corners, cool off, focus on other things, and maybe opportunities will arise later.
Anyway, Wang Yung, retreat to their corners is a term from American boxing matches where both the fighters in the ring for boxing go back to the corners of the ring and cool off. So just a quick grammatical or lexicological note there. We're almost out of time. Final comments, if any, from either Li Wei or Wang Yung. I think we're down to a minute or so.
Yes, I would like to say that we need the start to saving the relationship, starting from the very practical and small step. Now, both sides has done a good job in cooperations on the climate change. So I think the next step we can both agree to the taken off the Trump tariff. So not just the U.S. take initiative, like both sides should work, take action together to give the face of each other. Last point I would like to say, Bob, thank you very much for your contribution to the U.S.-China relations in last so many decades. Thank you very much.
Nali. Friends, I think, Trenton, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we're now out of time. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. We'll go to a 5-minute break now.
Friends, let's thank Li Wei and Wang Yung and Arthur for a very stimulating exchange of thoughts. I really think it went very well. Thank you very much. We break for 5 minutes.
Okay, Bob.
Thank you.
Professor Lambton, you may begin.
Well, thank you. I thought that last session and last evening's sessions were just superb and provide a great foundation for us to proceed in this panel. I want to say I'm David Lampton. It's good morning here in America and good evening in China, and want to wish everybody a good day. I'm currently at Johns Hopkins SAIS and been there for many years. Also, I just want to say Li Wei's slogan, Kohao, that China can change itself and change the US, I think is true. But I think the reciprocal is true. And maybe behind both of these statements, that we can each change ourselves and therefore the other, points to the fact that we really have to just pursue our own interest properly understood. And what's so frustrating is I don't think either of us is operating according to our own interests. So in that sense, I'm an optimist. If we just get a little more sensible, I think would be in a better position. I want to start by thanking our convening organizations, presenters, and of course the viewers that are participating as well. This is an important and I think critical time in our relationship, and I'm just so pleased that USAT and China Foreign Affairs University were able to engineer what I think is a very good meeting at a critical time. I also want to express my thanks to the people participating on this panel, Professor Jia Dao-Jung, and he's known to all of us, I think, very well. I've known him for many years. I always learn greatly from him, and he's at Beidou. My good friend, Dr. Stephen Roach at Yale, and for many years before that at Morgan Stanley, has been really one of the great contributors to the US-China economic relationship. And I want to thank Professor Sun-Ji Sheng for both being a commentator and for her leadership in putting together this program. So I would be more fulsome in my thanks, but we don't have time for too much politeness. Our panel today concerns lessons learned and not learned over the last 50 years. And I want to make it clear to our audience that in pursuing this topic, I hope we have some time for at least a couple of questions at the end. So use your Q&A function as we move along. I would start by asking, can Americans and Chinese, or can these Americans here today and these Chinese here today agree on two basic facts? First, the era of constructive engagement was long-lasting. It brought great economic and peace benefits to our two countries. The peace dividend and globalization led to rapid increases in global income and per capita incomes. And I very much agree with the comment that was just made. There were distributional problems in both of our societies, but frankly, that's not the fault of each of us with respect to the other. It's our own policy that led to those maldistributions internally. And also one of the big benefits, if you think about it, in the opening, in the first Cold War, the two biggest wars of the Cold War were in Asia, and they both involved China and the United States. And for the next 50 years, we haven't had such conflict. That is a huge accomplishment. Second, can we agree that the policies that we each had during the period of engagement, at least in the security area, I would characterize it as reassurance. Our policy was to reassure each other that we would be mindful of one another's interests and make space within the international system for each other. And that we, therefore, were not pursuing a policy of deterrence. Quite frankly, we are both explicitly and frequently articulating our fundamental security policy is deterrence. And deterrence is based on threat. And of course, once one side makes a threat, you get an escalatory ladder, and it's very difficult to get off that ladder once you start. Frankly, it was the policy of reassurance that allowed each of us for much of the engagement period to lower defense spending and begin to devote it to more domestic and other concerns. We may not have used that peace dividend very well here in the US, but we certainly had it. Now, before asking Jiadao Zhang to speak, let me just try to summarize what I heard by way of lessons learned and lessons not learned from the preceding panels. And I thought all of the remarks that I've heard in the last 14 hours were excellent. Lesson one, really our relationship will not work if we base it on ideology. I think that was one of the key things Nixon and Mao agreed about, and there's no way that this relationship can be well managed if it's on an ideological basis. We quite frankly have to respect the internal decisions that each are making, whether we agree with it or not. That seems to me the first lesson. Now, of course, we ought to each be mindful about what we do internally, considering what its effects abroad are and with each other. But this relationship is headed in an ideological direction, and that's not good, and history tells us that. Secondly, we are playing the security card, and when we play the security card against each other, it infects the economic relationship, and much of the discussion we just heard bears on that point. You cannot insulate the economic relationship from a deteriorating security relationship, and that means export controls, barriers on trade and investment. It even infects the student and cultural relationship because we become concerned about technology transfer and so forth. So there is no way to pursue a rational economic policy if the security relationship is headed south. Third, when our relationship, and I think history shows this clearly, whenever our relationship is troubled, particularly in the security domain, we each begin to take actions with respect to Taiwan that further erode, and dangerously so, the US-China relationship. In other words, when we don't manage bilateral relations well, the first thing to go in a very dangerous way is our restraint with respect to Taiwan. Certainly a fourth lesson from the past is, I think, how wise, frankly, Deng Xiaoping was. We both act with greater respect towards each other when we focus on our own problems. The United States has problems, China has problems, we don't need problems with each other. And I think it was amazing, if you think at the start of reform, Deng Xiaoping not only didn't increase defense spending, he reduced defense spending and then thereafter held it at a rather low level. Now, granted, China's GNP was growing so fast, it could stay low and still add up to a lot of money. But the point is, we are both better off when we focus on our real internal problems. Certainly, another lesson that we've heard is that high defense spending really drives conflict, because in the end, our security apparatus looks at what each other's doing, not what it's saying. And what we do has a lot to do with how much money we spend on it. So the increased military spending in both our societies is a danger. And finally, I think the lesson really is that we have to have, everybody's mentioned, more dialogue. Quite frankly, I think with adequate preparation and in not too distant future, we both should try to get our presidents together for a really meaningful strategic talk and not have too many aides confusing the situation. So with all of that, I want to ask my good friend, Professor Jiadao Zhang, to make his remarks, followed by Professor Roach. And Steve, will you pick up right after Jiadao Zhang is done?
Yes.
Thank you. Professor Jia.
Thank you very much. A good evening from Beijing to everyone. And we're coming to the end of the workshop, so understandably there is going to be a bit of repetition. Let me just quickly move through some of the points that I prepared for this. Here from China, we need to realize that the past 50 years, partly or mainly, I wouldn't say mainly, partly since the Nixon visit to China, has been the most fortunate phase of history for China. We can have a long list of examples where China has achieved an unparalleled degree of security in the world. And this is a fact. But then, as has been mentioned, there has been a good deal of so-called ideology or simply arguments for the sake of making arguments. On the US side, there are some insistence that US security underpinned that Chinese prosperity. But here on the Chinese side, there is a determination to deny that the US had played a positive role. This for us as scholars, I would think, especially for us working in Chinese universities, we have a duty of coming to some sort of clarity on this point. I would say that the bilateral relationship with the United States is a positively enabling factor for China's development in the past 50 years. This is a key point that I think that we should have learned in terms of history, that lesson from the recent past. Now, here in China, there is a lot of interest in getting the relationship right. But as the society has become more diverse, there is a competition of definition, what is right, and then how to get that right. A lot of times that diversity on the Chinese side is not as well recognized. This is something we can discuss later on too. There's a bit of simplification on the US side that everything flows from one individual being the leader at the top. That's probably not so true. But in any case, today on the US side, you have talk about decoupling, you have, which is not just talk, it's actually policy. And there's also propositions like friend shoring or close shoring. That basically that means moving away from China. But on the Chinese side, you have a parallel development that says domestic circulation as the mainstay of development, and then use international circulation as a supplement. And that often, that formulation often supports giving more control to state-owned companies than if it's to a large degree possible, or to the maximum degree possible, to practice import substitution rather than engage in foreign businesses. Both are dangerous. Both are very dangerous. And as has been noted on both sides in security studies, there is popularity in identifying the other as the most consequential strategic competitor. And flowing from that, more than self-protection, flowing from that framing, there is a sort of built-in assumption of enmity. This is true of both sides. We have to sometimes, or too often, Chinese speakers are too ready to denounce the US side as being having a so-called geostrategic driven or Cold War mentality, but let's admit it, on the Chinese side, it's equally strong, or if not stronger. But we have to recognize that we are inescapable neighbors. We are not just neighbors who want to move away. In the worldwide web of commerce, ideas, and yes, even in security, national security. On some issues, when we get more familiar with each other, we like each other. On some other issues, when we get more familiar, as the good old saying says, familiarity breeds contempt. So it's very dangerous to make simplistic conclusions. There are some issues we appreciate each other, some either openly or quietly. There are some issues we don't like each other. So that should be normal. But then when you look around the world, it's impossible to build a virtual great wall between the two countries or two societies. You can do that, but it's impossible. I mean, you can think about doing that, but it's impossible to do it. Why? Because you look around the world in terms of the population mass, in terms of the level of creativity, in terms of the achievements, Chinese and Americans have both inspired each other and also benefited from each other. The end purpose of talking about relationship is not just to make some government happy or some political leaders support their views, while politicians is to serve the interest of the population. So what should we be doing moving forward? Again, there may be a bit of repetition from the past. I would come up with 6 points very quickly. First is that we have to remember no more Vietnam War. No more Vietnam means differences to different people, but no more Vietnam War. That is to say, you don't fight a war with each other over ideology or over some definition of order. If anything, why did Nixon came to China? He thought it was too costly for America to continue to fight in Vietnam. If you recall his speech at Guam in 1969, he did not come here to rescue China or anything else. A lot of things happened later on. We can go on and on. And actually, I would think some in America could have learned that lesson as well. Recently, the Biden administration had the 10 leaders of the 10 ASEAN countries, Southeast Asian countries in the White House. You look at what they told the Americans about China, about Russia. No more Vietnam. That's lesson number one. Lesson number two is that we have to be really careful about so-called soft power competition. There are a lot of jubilation on both sides. The talk of the East is on the rise, the West is in decline. This is stupid. There's no basis for that. We need to be very mindful of rhetorical scapegoating the other for our own, each side's own domestic woes. Really, the true value in this competition is in introspection and self-change. Third, there has been too little talk about the value of greenfield investment by Chinese companies in the US. If you look at how the US-Japan trade dispute concluded, Japanese companies successfully got to invest in the US, created jobs there, enlarged the tax base, and that eroded a lot of American societal misunderstanding or opposition to Japanese technology, Japanese ways of doing business. But today, the real danger is that so many Chinese are so happily celebrating, wonderful, right? Wonderful. They criticize the Americans for decoupling, but there's no real effort to promote Chinese investment in the US to create greenfield investment. Actually, Fuyao glass company a lot of times gets laughed at, gets jeered at in the Chinese social media. That's very wrong. That's very wrong. Greenfield investment, job creation in both societies is a much stronger so-called ballast stone than trade, because trade disrupts jobs, even in domestic context. Fourth, China is applying to join agreements like CPTPP or Digital Economic Partnership Agreements. Earlier, there was mentioning of the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreements. But there are difficulties. And lots of times what Japan does or Australia does, it often, goes to a lot of this negative credit goes to the United States. And the United States is not shy, with the so-called Indo-Pacific economic framework, whatnot. But what should China do? China should reform its domestic policies by aligning them with as many articles as possible. In other words, don't wait until just get implemented the policies in those agreements to narrow the differences. And that would enlarge the recognition abroad of the determination to reform. Fifth, between our two countries, the dialogues are important. Meeting among high-ranking officers and the head of state are important. But it's really what we work on is showing sympathy. Well, I'm sorry, not sympathy, showing empathy to the other side. A good example is the fentanyl. Fentanyl used to be a product that was exported from China, but then the Chinese side tightened the rules and regulations, and to make sure no components would go directly to China, certainly not the finished product because it was so potent. It affected the life of so many on the street in the United States. And that really extends to a really dangerous area of so-called competition. That's in biotechnology and also in public health. The most sorrowful loss for both societies, is that cooperation in public health has stopped. The 3 years of COVID response has taught no lesson whatsoever to either government about the need to get back to cooperation. They don't even cooperate on such simple things as recognizing drugs. This is stupid. There's no justification for that. It does not matter how flowery the language is in Chinese or in English. So we should get this, do something that's very commonsensical for your own people's health. There's nothing wrong with that. And last but not least, I would think, especially here, for those of us here in China who study American foreign policy, we need to rethink such framing as the US-led West, 美西方, right? Yeah, this a lot of times generates a good deal of imagination, a good deal of imposition of how dark the rest of the rest of the world is. Also leads to simplification or narrowing of our attention to those few extreme voices from the United States, especially that goes with politicking. I've spent too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Jia. And certainly the suggestions on fentanyl and COVID deserve a lot more positive attention from all of us and certainly our government. Steve, it's over to you.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks, Professor Jia, my good friend. Your proposals are, as usual, provocative and very interesting. The position of going last in several days of a conference has its benefits and its disadvantages. Let me try to focus on saying a few things that bring together many of the strains of thought that have been expressed and also offer some new approaches, if I may. As we look back on the miracle of February 1972, there's a strong inclination to try to recapture that miracle and do it again. And I'm here to tell you that forget it, it's not going to happen. The Nixon-Mao breakthrough was a breakthrough that led to extraordinary period of strategic diplomacy that opened up the relationship between the United States and China and really transformed the global environment, but we can't replicate that going forward. The relationship is more complex, the world is more complex. Both nations, in my opinion, despite their sort of muscular positioning in the world, are surprisingly vulnerable. And out of that vulnerability gives rise to the types of false narratives and blames that Arthur Kroeber eloquently described a few minutes ago that is very conflict prone in its tendency. So we need a new approach. And I just want to stress three aspects of that new approach that pick up on many of the themes that have been addressed in the parts of this conference that I have heard. Number one, we need to abandon our thinking that bilateral trade frictions need to be first and foremost the focal point of economic policy in both nations. Agreements like the now expired, thankfully, phase one trade deal between the United States and China are a classic example of a failed approach. It failed just as economic theory predicted. Chinese purchases fell 43% below the agreed upon trajectory of the deal. And America's trade deficit got worse, not better, over the last several years. We did, because of the tariffs, succeed in reducing Chinese imports into the US, but they were more than compensated for by sharply rising imports into Vietnam, Mexico, from Vietnam, Mexico, Taiwan, India, South Korea, Canada, even Italy and France. And the reason here is that we have a multilateral trade problem that reflects trade deficits last year with 106 countries. That's an outgrowth of our savings problem. We can't ever hope to fix a multilateral trade or savings problem by fixating on a bilateral remedy. So we have to give up on this type of bilateral trade fixation. Secondly, and this is a point that's been made by many of the earlier speakers, we need to shift the focus from a bilateral trade to addressing the structural impediments to economic growth. And here, the suggestions of resuming negotiations on a bilateral investment treaty are all well taken. I wholeheartedly endorse that. We have a number of structural issues that can be addressed through market opening initiatives that have been contained in bilateral investment treaties in the past, whether they're on innovation policy, technology transfer, industrial policy, government subsidies. It's in both nations' best interest to seek growth opportunities by opening their markets to one another. The US has signed 47 BITs, of which 39 are still in force. China has a record 106 BITs currently in force. We were 95% of the way to completing negotiations on a BIT before President Trump was elected. We stopped those negotiations. We need to resume immediately. And the third and final recommendation I'd like to make is one that I have not heard, but one that you've been dancing around, and that is addressing the approach of engagement between the two nations. The Nixon, Mao, Kissinger, Joe approach of strategic diplomacy does not work in a complex relationship like we had right now. Diplomacy, as noble as it is necessary but not sufficient, in large part because diplomacy at its root is driven by political values and political views. We need a process of engagement that is depoliticized. Leader-to-leader agreements, as important as they are, plus strategic and economic dialogues that have occurred over the last couple of decades, with the exception of the Trump administration, have become an episodic, unworkable framework for dialogue and engagement. So I think we need to move beyond a politicized diplomacy and establish a new institutionalized framework of engagement that, for lack of a better term, I would call it a permanent US-China secretariat. And that comes with a full-time complement of high-level professionals from both nations located in a neutral office, in a neutral venue, working 24/7 on all aspects of this relationship. And I want to stress the potential of the Secretariat. It's something that I detail in a new book coming out in a few months called Accidental Conflict, America, China, and the Clash of False Narratives, which is, again, in keeping with the excellent point that Arthur Kromer made earlier. The new Secretariat should have 4 functions. 1, relationship framing. Focus on developing a collaborative research program with jointly authored policy white papers, development of a joint database that is managed, that puts facts on the same page for both nations, their leaders, and their defense establishments. Secondly, a convening function. The new Secretariat should be a clearinghouse of expert talent, bringing together networks of far-flung experts, such as those in academic institutions, think tanks, platforms like this, Track 2 dialogues, focused on problem solving. Example being the outbreak of COVID. The Secretariat should have convened immediately a meeting of public health experts in the US and China, scientists, as well as those engaged in disease prevention and control, to come up with the protocols to address COVID rather than to blame each other for the origins. Thirdly, oversight and compliance. The new Secretariat should focus on the implementation and monitoring of existing and new agreements like a BIT, and provide dashboards on the implementation and tracking of agreements. The Secretariat, in keeping with that third function, should be a first stop for dispute resolution rather than getting bogged down in the contentious frameworks of resolving disputes such as we have now in the WTO, and that would be applicable to the implementation of a new BIT. And fourthly would be an outreach function, a public relations function, sponsoring conferences, a public version of the database, quarterly review, and provide a formal a platform for briefing the world on the complexities as well as the possible resolutions of US-China conflict. Look, we've come a long way over the last 50 years, and we did it because we came together at a time when we needed to do it. The approach that we used, driven by brilliant, although troubled statesmen at the time, was based on an extraordinary breakthrough of diplomacy, largely reflecting the political agendas of 2 leaders. We cannot expect to get the same results from the same approach going forward. We need a more formal, institutionalized approach to coming together, and we need to do it before it is too late, because the clock is ticking, and I am worried that it runs the risk of being too late. I'll stop on that point.
Thank you, Steve. And I must say that's the first really tangible, hopeful, and quite possibly productive suggestion I've heard. I hope we'll all think about it and recommend it to people who can perhaps effectuate something like that. Now we have Professor and Vice President at China Foreign Affairs University, Professor Sun Ji-shun. Let me welcome you to the microphone, Professor Sun, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Lapton. It's a great pleasure to have listened to the talks of the 2 distinguished speakers, which I think are very useful and helpful, especially for the suggestions they proposed just now. Professor Zhao has put forward 6 points, and Professor Roche has proposed to establish a general secretariat, which I think is very, very insightful. And then after I listened to their talk, actually some of them are very similar with my understanding regarding bilateral relations. I would also like to add several points. Also, I combine some of my comment, with my own understanding. We all talked about the difficult points or the difficult aspects confronted with, faced with the bilateral relations. It's very difficult. It seems it's very difficult to manage through. That's why we talk about the ways out. But for my understanding, besides the economic, diplomatic, strategic, or political aspects, there are several points I think we do need to improve. The first point is we do need to take concrete measures to improve the language and the general atmosphere between the two countries. Because if we look at the past 50 years, the atmosphere or the language between the two sides generally is cooperative and peaceful, although there are differences. If we think about Nixon's time, how different we were at that time, but still the language at that time is cooperative and friendly. And then it lasted throughout the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, I guess, until the starting of the trade friction or the trade war. Although after 2 years of trade friction or trade war, the two sides have reached some trade deals. However, the language, the general language, and also the general atmosphere has been damaged. Or we can say has been damaged completely to hostile, conflictual, competitive. So this kind of change is very harmful. Why? The first negative influence is it will lead to negative interpretation of everything that is going on between the two sides. We say the same language, but different interpretation. So it makes communication and view exchanges even more difficult. And even for some positive signals, they might be interpreted negatively or even missed. And the second negative influence is it will negatively influence the general public opinion. And also, the most important thing is the young people, our next generation, which might also in turn influence the policy of the language of the government. So it reinforces each other. I think Professor Roach also mentioned that just now. He proposed one of the functions of the General Secretariat is to better manage the public relations, better inform the people, better inform the audience of the two peoples of the two countries, and also the people of the whole world. And then the third point, we do need to take action to bridge the discursive gap between the two. It seems we are having dialogues. Especially when we read when we listen to the speeches of both sides, they are talking. Sometimes they talk about very similar things, but they mean differently. They mean quite differently. For instance, about international order, Chinese side always emphasize we uphold international order based on the UN Charter and the international law. And Secretary Blinken also emphasized that. But for China, it seems the US order is not this kind of order. So we use the same words, but we mean quite differently. And then another example is the US, for instance, the US said, emphasized our policy has not changed. What has changed is Beijing's growing coercion. And then from China's side, how can you say your policy has not changed from a constructive strategic partnership to strategic competitor to the most serious competitor to challenger or international order reshaper? so on and so forth. So how can you say you did not change? So you can see from these examples, we can say that sometimes we use the same language, but we do mean different things. There's a huge discursive gap between the two. So if we do not bridge this kind of gap, and then even more dialogues we will have, even more communication we will have, probably they will not be that effective. So that's the first argument I want to make. So we do need to bridge the discursive gap to improve the language and general atmosphere between the two countries. And the second point is how can we move forward so far since we are faced with so many difficulties? I think one of the starting point can be both China and the US need to take concrete actions to better deal global governance. Especially the most serious global issues such as climate change, public health, and economic recovery. Why do I say this way? Because if we compare the world after World War II and the world today, this is the major difference. At that time, we did not have that many global issues, but nowadays, no. I think both China and the United States have agreement on that, and also people from the two countries. I was inspired by Professor Roach's point. He also mentioned, we need to change the approach of engagement. So we start from concrete issue areas, and also this is a way for us to improve our diplomacy, maybe creative diplomacy or whatever. But we need to focus on specific issue areas. And Professor Roach also mentioned desecuritize it and depoliticalize it. These are the two words we use in China to describe the current China-US relation. We can see many issues have been politicalized or pan-securitized. So if we move to these concrete areas, we can try our best to depoliticalize them and also to desecuritize them. And this is also a kind of positive signal, not only to the two countries, but also to the whole world. That means China and the United States, number one, the largest economy and the second largest economy can cooperate. And we can send positive signals for the whole world to let the world believe the world is not divided. So the two countries are still together to confront, global challenges. And then the third point I would like to make is we do need to strengthen people exchanges. I think all of us have mentioned that. Definitely, this is a must. And number 4 is I think the two sides needs to put on others' shoes, and to I think Professor Zhang also mentioned that we need to strengthen our empathy. But how can we do that? We do need to think about the other's culture, because for me, culture really influences people's way of thinking, people's way of behavior. And we have different cultural backgrounds, and then the starting point might be different, and the understanding and the interpretation is also different. So, for instance, when I read the speeches, by American, for instance, Secretary of State or presidents, so on and so forth, they often say, well, the Chinese people are what? The Chinese government, the CPC are, it's a clear separation. But actually for Chinese people, we don't think that way. The Chinese people and the CPC are together, and the government and people are together. We seldom separate. So this kind of misunderstanding often happens. And then last but not least, I do agree. I think all the speakers emphasize that we both have our own problems, domestic problems. either from the U.S. perspective or from our own perspective. So a very big challenge is to do our own things well. And then if we can do our own things well, and then that's a kind of, how do we say, a very useful, how do I say, support to argue against the other side. So that's all I want to share. Yeah, back to you, Dr. Lampton.
Well, thank you, Professor Sun. We don't have much time, but we have been given dispensation to go about 5 more minutes. Let me ask each of our panelists, Ja and Steve Roach, each one question. I'll ask them both up front, and then hopefully we can get through those with each person taking a minute or two to answer. Professor Ja, I was struck, and it resonated very positively to me. You talked about greenfield investment in the U.S., and I would hypothesize U.S. investment in China probably has the same salutary effects. But what you were really saying is Chinese investment in employment generating jobs in the United States is an important factor in getting greater positive relations. And I agree. I just would observe that our government and to some extent your government are impeding that outward flow of investment. And I spent many years in the Midwest where I saw the benefits of foreign direct investment, in that case from Japan, but later from China as well. So my question is how can we reach directly to the states and provinces and energize them as supports for our bilateral relations? And Steve, I wanted just to ask you, you talked about BIT, I agree. You said it's a multilateral world, we have to handle it differently, I agree. But I wanted a clarifying question. You're not opposed to bilateral negotiations to get rid of the tariffs we have, are you? In other words, can't we sort of walk on 2 feet? Not everything's multilateral. In fact, we might even unilaterally drop tariffs. So over to you, Ja.
Okay. Well, it's a regret that under the Obama administration, there were a forum for governors level and provincial head of government here in China. They launched forums, had meetings. But as you know, on the US, they have different states, and the rotation of the chairmanship of that forum was I wouldn't say complex, it just became, there was a little consistency on the Chinese side as well. And then I participated in some of that preparation on the sidelines as a scholar. And then very much like what Steve, I think with Arthur Kruger earlier on, the Chinese side probably also, there was too much of a taking cues from the foreign ministry of China, more specifically, and then the foreign ministry would emphasize the correct attitude, the right atmosphere, and that often, very often, turns out to prevent the actual mayors or investors from saying, let's call it a spade a spade. There's money to be made. I'm welcome here, let's do it. But then when you have emphasis from the foreign ministry folks saying we need to have these deals to be part of that improvement of overall generous, it gets, I think for those of us who worked on these matters, it's a deep regret, but I wanted to highlight this. This is extremely dangerous for China. It's extremely dangerous. And what's the lack of Chinese investment in the US, the lack of Chinese effort to create jobs in the United States and generate the tax base. If you look at how Germany overcame the American dislike in the 60s, if you look how Japan overcome the American dislike in the 80s and 90s, it was creating jobs in the United States. But here, I'm basically repeating what I said earlier on, but I do hope that we can, these forums can contribute to redefining the sort of paradigm for the engagement. One thing is certainly to stop this kind of criticism of people like Cao De-Wang, who invest in Fuyao glass factories. If President Obama supported Netflix can make a documentary about it, that means it's appreciation in the United States. But strangely, on the Chinese side, it was overwhelmingly denounced as being unpatriotic. This is stupid. Yes, America has military power there. When they use that, whatever, however you imagine the so-called intention, they have these weapons, right? But then you don't do nothing to give a stake to the other side for not losing, for just going ahead in the extreme dangerous way. And then likewise, here, American U.S. investments in China, especially greenfield investments, needs to be encouraged and highlighted, supported. We should stop saying that, just working with the Wall Street bankers. Those bankers, a lot of times, their money does not come from America either. Their money comes from whoever deposits in their banks, including from the Middle East, where. They don't really have to. They don't really have a direct impact with American society.
Yeah.
The foreign policy extension of domestic politics. That's the real lesson we need to learn.
Right, I think.
Steve,
we got
one
it.
last question. Yeah, well, you get it, right? We cannot somehow expect another Nixon, another Mao. That's the point. Everybody has to be the Nixon and everybody has to be the Mao.
Yeah. Steve.
Thanks, Mike. Look, we don't need bilateral negotiations to rescind the tariffs. We need the courage of one leader to start that process, and I think it should come from the U.S. side. And I certainly agree that the tariffs should be rescinded immediately. I just want to pick up on one loose end here. We all talk about the need to fix our own problems. What we don't recognize is that our problems in both nations are big and getting bigger. We're not as strong as we think we are. That's true of the United States with its massive shortfall of domestic savings. That's true of China with its failed efforts to rebalance its economy to a more sustainable and stable platform. Those vulnerabilities are what create these false narratives that have led to this process of conflict. Our diplomats are not going to solve this problem for us. Example, I don't have to go any further. March 2021, the disaster in Anchorage, the two top diplomats from both countries fought with each other like children. They introduced divisive, corrosive rhetoric that poisoned any attempts of a new U.S. administration under the anti-Trump Joe Biden to come up with an enlightened view on policy. Don't trust diplomats. They are politicized animals. That's why I am in favor of a depoliticized U.S.-China Secretariat that takes the politicization out of managing the world's most important relationship. If we address this relationship professionally with a team of well-qualified experts in all aspects of the relationship, from economics and trade to health to climate to cybersecurity, we can get things done between us, especially if we are charged with producing jointly authored policy white papers that filter down to our respective governments. This is not an opportunity for politicized diplomats to solve our problems. If we rely on that, heaven help us, it's going to go from bad to worse.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, all the panelists. Thank you, the audience. I'm sorry we didn't get to audience Q&A, but we just, there weren't enough minutes in the program. Anyway, back to our overall moderator here.
Yes, thank you. Now we'd like to invite Professor Shi to please begin her panel.
Hi, everyone. Good morning and good evening from the two sides of the Pacific. I'm very honored to moderate the second session. I'm Shi Yi from China Foreign Affairs University, the co-host of this webinar. Actually, I have attended many times the previous ASN conferences and very glad to see this year's event happening so successfully, although the only pity probably is we have to do this online. We have listened to the speakers from the two panels in this evening's discussion. They are very insightful. So personally, I'm still digesting all these great thoughts. In this session of moderated discussion, we have 5 distinguished speakers, and they will make comments about the panel topics or share their views on the general topic of this webinar. After their speeches, the discussion will be open to members of the previous 2 panels and then to the audience. Before the speakers begin, I would like to gently remind you that each of the speakers will have about 8 minutes to share your views. And the conversation will begin with Professor Da Wei. And Dr. Da is the director of the Center for International Security and Strategy at Tsinghua and professor in the Department of International Relations, School of Social Science, Tsinghua University. And his research expertise covers China-US relations and US security and foreign policy, et cetera, et cetera. So I will give the floor to Professor Da, please.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Professor Shi. And thank USCET for inviting me. Finally, I can see Bob and also Ambassador Block maybe later. I have 8 minutes, right? 8 minutes, so I will try to be brief. Let me set my cell phone. Okay. After listening to the discussion panelists before us, I think I learned a lot about their analysis and also suggestion. Our topic is about the 50th anniversary of the Nixon's visit, the breaking ice. So I think I totally agree with Mr. Roach that this kind of breakthrough cannot happen, would not happen in foreseeable future in China-US relations. I think it happened 50 years ago based on 3 preconditions, and we don't have either of that now. The first one is the international order or international structure changed and already finished its changing, and also the order becomes quite stable, and the 2 sides, both China and the US, realization or understanding of that order were same at that time. I mean, that's in the Cold War, and the Soviet Union enjoying some kind of advantage in late 1960s. So both China and the US acknowledged that change. But today, the international order is still undergoing dramatic changes, and it has not been stabilized. So I don't know how long we still need, but obviously, for instance, we are witnessing the war in Ukraine, so the order itself is changing. And the understanding of the order or understanding of the change between China and the US are different, extremely different. The second precondition is at least one side, or maybe both sides, believed that the original position, original policy is not in their interest. Both China and the United States realized that a bad China-US relationship was not in their interest, and they feel kind of common interest from the Soviet Union. But now, I think probably both China and the US believe that they are going to win this competition. Both sides believe they have a better system, and both sides believe that time is on their side. So if we have 2 peers who believe they are going to win, how can we expect they change their policy and try to achieve some accommodation. So I think unless those two preconditions changed, we won't see a dramatic change in our bilateral relations now. So before we reach the point that we can have some kind of accommodation, probably we can only try to keep patient and also waiting for that point. We need to wait for the new international order stabilized, and we also need to observe the two sides' domestic development, and we to see if current trajectory is acceptable or at least tolerable for China and the US. If a bad bilateral relations is tolerable for the US, for instance, for your inflation, for your economic growth, and if bad relationship is acceptable for China to continue our economic and social development, we will draw our conclusion in the coming years. And also, I think the US, in the US, the domestic politics is still have some uncertainty. I don't know what will happen after the year 2024. And China will have our party congress, so we will also need to follow the domestic political development in China after the fall. But in this period of transition, probably there are several things we need to do. Many of our analysts, our panelists already touched upon some. I think the first one is the talk between the two militaries. And the Secretary Austin and Minister Wei Fenghe already met in Singapore. That's good news. I hope they can continue. Secondly, I think extremely important is Taiwan. I think that's very, very dangerous. And if we continue current trajectory, I think we are doomed in some kind of military conflict in the future, in the not too long future, maybe, I don't know, 5 years or 6 years. It's extremely dangerous. So we have to be clear about our red lines. The third one, of course, is resumption of the official dialogue. I think the suggestion of Mr. Rochi is very interesting. The fourth, everyone mentioned the people to people, of course, extremely important, but I want to say the exchanges between the two scholars, the scholars from the two countries are extremely important. There are two perceptions we need to clarify, help the other side to clarify. On China's side, I think Chinese need to help the American expert to clarify if China already decided to, have a confrontation of different camps with the U.S. I think Secretary Blinken, in his speech at the very beginning, said China is determined to have a competition with the US, and it's a competition between democracy and authoritarianism. I really not so sure. I don't know China's vision of that. I don't think China have one. So I think probably Secretary Blinken made a mistake on that. But probably we need to help our American colleagues to understand that. And I think American experts need to help me or convince me that the US is not going to keep China down, as I think Arthur mentioned that in previous discussion. I agree with him that the US helped China a lot in history, but is the US helping China, or is the US going to help China in the future? I'm not sure. I think many things the US is doing, I think is at least prevent China from, develop, particularly in those sensitive areas, develop too fast or to surpass the US. I hope I'm wrong, but I hope our American colleagues can convince me, can help me to understand that. I think my time already almost used up all my time, so I better stop here. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Da. You actually saved us 1 minute. Thank you. So our second speaker will be Professor Xie Tao. Dr. Xie Tao is a professor and dean of the School of International Relations and Diplomacy at Beijing Foreign Studies University. And his interests include US Congress elections, public opinion, and China-US relations. Now the floor is yours, Professor Xie.
Okay, good morning, participants from United States. I see a lot of familiar faces like Professor Nampton, Bob, and others. And so my gratitude to Ambassador Julia Jiang-Plok. This is, I think, the third time that I participated in an ASN American Studies Network conference, and used to be held at Beihai too. So today I will use this very limited 8 minutes to talk about something that I've been musing about in the past couple of days. I call this "Long Live Henry Kissinger," but it's time to move beyond his legacy. So on May 31st, the Chinese People's Institute of Foreign Affairs organized a symposium themed Kissinger and China-US relations, a kind of a semi-official birthday party for Dr. Kissinger, the Chinese people's old friend who just turned 99. Mr. Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, delivered congratulatory remarks online. So let me be clear up front. I deeply respect Dr. Kissinger, both as a scholar, as a statesman. And his strategic vision helped to turn two erstwhile enemies into partners. And it's a stunning diplomatic success that led to a fundamental restructuring of the global geopolitical order. So when he and President Richard Nixon opened America's door to China, and he also opened China's door to America and to the rest of the world. And so Nixon's visit 50 years ago paved the way for China's reform and opening up, as you all know, which has brought about the dramatic rise of China as a great power. And so for those of you who are here listening right now, I know Professor Nampton and Bob, the Confucian culture values gratitude. And as the Chinese saying goes, the grace of dripping water should be reciprocated by a gushing spring. And so the Chinese government has repeatedly expressed its indebtedness to Dr. Kissinger for his singular contribution to China-US relations. And the semi-official birthday party been an example. But the birthday party is not merely another celebratory occasion. The Chinese participants, and some of whom I know very well personally, made it very clear that they are eager to see a much younger Kissinger among US policymakers, who is able and willing to salvage the current bilateral relationship. However, at the risk of offending Kissinger's Chinese fans, and many of whom are high-ranking Chinese officials, I will argue that it's long overdue that Beijing get over with its Kissinger complex and focus instead on structural factors that stand in the way of US-China relations. Leaders make a big difference in foreign policy, of course, and a personal rapport between leaders undoubtedly help to reduce misunderstandings and misperceptions while fostering trust and cooperation. But no matter how close leaders are at the personal level, they are representatives of their respective governments. And besides, leaders are constrained by history. That is, the particular domestic and international reality they faced when they are making a decision. So thus, Kissinger's secret visit to Beijing would not have been possible had it not been for a sharp deterioration in China-USSR relations. Right? That's a fact that we all know for those of who study US-China relations. But 50 years later, today, the geopolitical landscape is so dramatically different compared with the 50 years ago. China has become a global power, and America is in apparent political and economic decline. So thus, China is widely viewed by US policymakers as the most serious long-term threat to America's global dominance. So if there were a younger Kissinger, I think that he would probably be musing about a secret visit to Moscow right now. So that being said, our gathering tonight shows that we still believe that old friends, quote, can play a meaningful role in the bilateral relationship, right? But it would be foolish to put all hopes of a better US-China relationship solely on old friends, especially somebody who's too old. And that would be an unbearable heaviness of friendship, I would say. So we are better off, I would argue, addressing the structural factors in both countries, domestic and international, that have sent the bilateral relationship on a sharp downturn trajectory. And many of these factors, such as ideological differences that Professor Dawei just mentioned, and the global economic trends like Professor Li Wei discussed, are largely out of the control of our dear old friends. So let me just conclude here. I normally don't read from my prepared remarks, but tonight, because I think this is a very special occasion, and so I'm better off reading off from my remarks. And so again, it's my big honor to be here, and it's very nice to see again old friends. And I really look forward to going to the United States to see you in person. I like to say the last time I was in the United States, it was before Donald Trump was elected the president. And so that was more than 5 years ago. Okay, that's all for my remarks. And back to you, Professor Shi.
Thank you, Professor Xie. Yes, we all share the same feeling. We mentioned people-to-people exchange, and all of us really want to have a better chance to have a face-to-face discussion and maybe visiting each other as new friends and old friends. Thank you so much. And then our next speaker will be Dr. Zhou Qi. Dr. Zhou is director of the Institute of Global Governance and Development at Tongji University. Previously, Dr. Zhou was the director of American Studies Center at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences and the director of Western European Studies Center at Fudan University. And I think Zhou is very familiar with Professor Zhou. Now the floor is all yours.
Professor Zhou, you're muted.
Thank Professor Shi very much, and it's a good chance to talk with and exchange views with my good friends here. Like Professor Lampton, I haven't seen him for about at least 4 years. It's quite a long time. And also thank to Bei Wai and Julia. We have been very good friends for a long time. Okay, now I'm starting my talking. I think I'd like to emphasize more about the obstacles and the difficulties that we're facing between our two countries. Honest to say, I feel because you know, we are trying to find a way out of the current difficulties between the two countries, but I feel it's very difficult to find such a way. China has been relatively passive in the deterioration of the Sino-US relations. I don't mean that we don't have any problem or you know, we have done nothing wrong. The Chinese government definitely still wants to have a good relationship with the United States, though there are some warriors among ordinary people and the intellectuals in the Chinese society. Xi Jinping once emphasized that there are thousand reasons to make a Sino-US relationship good, no single reason to make it worse. China's attitude so far has not changed. Recently, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi also urged that we should not let the US relations deteriorate. But here the key is what is the thinking of the U.S. policymakers? Now the U.S. side regretted. Professor Kerber, Arthur talked about the U.S. contribution to Chinese economic development. We agree, and we thank to U.S. efforts. But however, now the U.S. side regretted letting China enter into the WTO in 2000, according to American 2018 National Security Strategy. Many in American political circle have now questioned Clinton's approach, arguing that letting China into the WTO is the biggest mistake of the US policies. Because this policy gave China an opportunity for fast economic development, but ended up cultivating a strong competitor to the United States. Since the Trump era, there has been a bipartisan consensus in the US that China is America's biggest strategic competitor and challenger. In the last year of Trump's administration, some senior governmental officials were sent to give talks to the public in the US. They traced the China policy of the US successive administrations and described China as a direct threat to, direct threat to the United States and Western political system, way of life, and the fundamental values. These talks, I guess, have certain influence on American public. The influence, if we talk about, if we are talking about the influence by this kind of speeches, I can give an example. For example, now most of the American people felt that they have no reason to doubt what American media and the politicians have portrayed about the Chinese government's policy in Xinjiang. That is systematic genocide, forced abortion, religious persecution, and forced labor. Actually, my research team have spent 10 days in Xinjiang to make survey and has written 20,000 Chinese character report on Xinjiang afterwards. Well, it must be admitted that there are a lot of problems in Xinjiang. Those accusations by the US government are basically not true. But to American people who are so sensitive about the human rights, I guess they would not keep, they would like to keep a good relationship with such a country whose government gravely violates human rights, let alone other existing issues in Hong Kong, Tibet, and the South China Sea. Now the US is carrying out a decoupling policy toward China. I wonder why in our discussion, nobody before has been talking about this. Although decoupling is not a typical Cold War, its effect is not different from that of the Cold War. Decoupling from China does not only happen in the industry chain, but industry chain, trade chain, and value chain, but also in a high-tech field. Technology decoupling has become a core part of the US policy of decoupling from China. The reason is that in the past decade, the high-tech sector, which was the fastest growing industry in the global economy, has gained a position as a foundation of a global economy. If taking a look of a list provided by Joe Bateman, a researcher at the Carnegie endowment entitled the Washington's Large and Growing Toolkit of Technology Restrictions, you would find that it includes export controls, investment restrictions, telecoms licensing, and equipment authorization, visa restrictions, import restrictions, financial sanctions, technology transactions, transaction rules, etc. So the American decoupling measures are really comprehensive. In 2020, the Trump administration set tougher rules for specific companies. That is Huawei and its more than 150 affiliates on the entity list. These companies need a Commerce Department permission to import foreign semiconductor whose designs and finished chips contain some American technology. Since the US maintains significant leadership in the semiconductor design, software, and certain parts of the semiconductor manufacturing tools, this amounts to a blank ban. Restrictions were also imposed on the personnel exchange as well. The COVID-19 pandemic, which we have talked quite much, has cut off travels between the two countries, but artificial barriers by the US government are more worrying. In 2020, Trump suspended the entry of all foreign graduate students and researchers, past or present, associated with entities in the People's Republic of China, implanting or supporting civil military integration strategy. Biden kept the policy. The policy has so far led to revocation of more than 1,000 visas and rejection of at least 700 to 1,300 visas applications. Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology estimates that between 3,000 and 5,000 Chinese students and STEM researchers may be denied each year. Trump has also limited the Communist Party members and their families to one entry visas, valid for 1 month, while other Chinese can get multiple entry visas lasting up to a decade. The Biden administration has since retained the policy. In short, the US cannot allow China to become a competitor capable of challenging the US economy and was economic and strategic dominance. Then on Taiwan issue, Biden has said that the US does not support Taiwan independence, but the US policy towards Taiwan has gone so far. That is just one step away from supporting Taiwan independence. When Biden answered to the reporter's question, if China launched the military attack on Taiwan, would the US use military force to support Taiwan? He answered yes. What makes the Sino-US relations more complicated is the breakout of the Russia-Ukraine military conflict. A senior diplomat at the US Embassy told me that in his phone conversation with Biden, Xi's conversation with Biden, Biden said that the US policy toward China would depend on China's position on the Russia-Ukraine war. However, in the absence of a change in the current US policy toward China, what choice can the US expect China to make? Robert Zulik concludes, if I were in Beijing position, I would also conclude that the US will not accept China's rise and that China would have to act accordingly. At this point, what can turn the US back? There are probably only two circumstances under which the US could reconsider its policy towards China, on this, I'm quite pessimistic. First is the US cannot go any further in restricting China. If the interdependent of the global economy and the decoupling have brought serious economic decline to the United States, which will force the US to change its policy. Now, for the sake of security interests, the United States is ready to accept the result of the so-called killing 1,000 enemies and losing one own 800 soldiers. I guess only when the danger to the United States exceeds the damage to China will the US adjust its policy. Second, when a major international event occurs, the US might suffer significant losses without cooperation with China, as did with the Soviet expansionism during the Cold War. But so far, no such event is now in sight. So that is my judgment about the U.S.-China relations, and I cannot see obvious way out of our current difficulties. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Zhou. And our next speaker will be Dr. Robert Kapp, the president of Robert A. Kapp and Associates, and former president of the U.S.-China Business Council. Actually, he stayed in this position for 10 years, from 1994 to 2004. And Dr. Kapp is special advisor now for the U.S.-China Education Trust and a member of the advisory council. Now the floor is yours. Thank you.
Professor Sher, thank you for calling on me, but I prefer to speak last.
Okay. Okay, so you prefer to speak last.
I'm the only American on this panel, and I'd like to hear the views of all the Chinese on the panel first. Give me 5 minutes at the end.
All right, sure. Then
Thanks.
Professor Zhang, it will be good for you to speak first. Okay, so you are mute. But before that, yes, before you turn on your mic, I can't hear you now. But while you are doing that, let me kindly introduce my colleague, Professor Ran Jijun. We have been working together for many years, actually. And he's professor and also dean of the Department of English and International Studies, China Foreign Affairs University. And he got his PhD in mass communication from the School of Journalism and Communication at Peking University. And his academic interests range from political communications to international politics and so on and so forth. So now the floor is yours. Professor Zhang, can you try? I can't hear you. Trenton, can you?
No, Professor Ran, click the arrow button next to the microphone at the bottom left of your screen. And where it says select a microphone, make sure you have the appropriate one selected there.
Professor Ran and I are giving Shi a hard time.
Okay, so Trenton's suggestion is try the small button to make sure you are using the right microphone, right?
Yes. Professor, we still can't hear you.
老冉，你需要选择一下那个麦克风，你试试。就在那个静音旁边有一个小三角，点开，它出有一个选项框。
Dr. Kapp, would you like to go ahead while we figure out these tech issues?
Let's go to Xietao.
He already spoke.
He's already finished.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, now we
Sure.
do. Yes, yes. There we go.
Okay.
Perfect.
Yes, please.
Sorry for the confusion. Okay. Okay.
I suppose you are using two devices. Yes, that's the problem.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for your introduction. I'm sorry for the confusion. So basically, what I want to talk actually are 3 points. I just want to echo some of the comments made by Professor Zhao Zuisheng in the morning session about. So I agree with him that actually, I mean, the media between China and the United States of America are in great trouble, but I think it's not always so. So basically, I would just talk about, I'll just offer a very brief historical review of the media interactions between China and the United States. And secondly, I'll talk about why media actually matter in the bilateral relations. And thirdly, why media interactions are that important. Nowadays, running through, like some of the social networking or narratives hyping, like a media war between China and the United States of America. But I would say that that's not always so. The media interaction between the two countries actually can date back to like 1832, when Bridgman, the first American missionary to China, actually initiated in Canton the first American round newspaper named Chinese Repository, the 中国丛报, hiring local news people to introduce China to the American people. So that can be considered as the very beginning of the interaction between the media people between the two countries. While in 1922, Yenching University actually relaunched the journalism program with the support of a Missouri School of Journalism, which set a special Missouri Yenching exchange program with Yenching University Journalism Department to train a large number of journalists. And this kind of educational model has actually been promoted among the Chinese universities. But between the 1950s and the early 1970s, I think the interactions between the media were suspended, especially after the Korean War. During that period of time, the media from both sides can only imagine the situation of the other side across the Pacific Ocean. So when Richard Nixon took the icebreaking trip to China on February 1972, American media were very enthusiastic in covering the trip. Actually, in the last month before Nixon's trip, the White House and Beijing remained at odds over the number of reporters in the delegation. After some rounds of negotiation, it is confirmed that the number of journalists should not exceed 87, plus dozens of technicians. In the media course were a lot of big names in the US press, including Dan Rother, Walter Cronkite, and also Theodore White. Actually, in this kind of event, in covering this event, there were a lot of innovations by the media between the two sides. For example, like they co-established a news center, and also they actually set a kind of transmission antenna in accordance with the regulation of both countries. So firstly, the US side actually set such kind of antenna and then just sell this to the China side, and then China just rent this antenna to the American media corps to file some of the news reports back to the United States. And after this visit, actually, Xinhua News Agency and the Associated Press signed the first media cooperation agreement since the founding of PRC. And after China's entry into WTO, China's media actually adopted a model of public institution but private business model. So China's media actually has become more and more incentivized to actually cooperate with their counterparts in the United States of America. We have seen a lot of such kind of cooperative projects between the two sides. I just want to share one example, that is the Sino-US Journalist Exchange Project. It's jointly organized by the China Journalist Association and the East-West Center of the United States. This project aims to deepen mutual understanding between the media of the two countries, and also provide opportunities for 6 to 7 Chinese journalists to travel to the United States and 6 to 7 American journalists to travel to China. This project actually has been running from September 2010 to September 2018, involving at least 56 media representatives from both sides. And from such kind of active interactions between the media from the two sides, we can see that there is a kind of clear positive correlation between the bilateral relations and also the extent of this kind of media interactions. And the second question I want to address is actually why media matters. We see media actually serve as a bridge to foster mutual understanding between the Chinese and American people. And according to a study conducted jointly by the Huazhong University of Technology and a very renowned public relations company in the United States of America, involving more than 3,000 respondents, indicate that actually the major source of information of the other country actually come from media between the two countries. So it means that even when we actually talk about the increased people exchanges between the two countries, but still for most of the people in the two countries, their primary source of information about other country actually is still media. And more than that, actually, according to this study, television, news websites, and the social networks are the 3 most important channels through which the American and the Chinese public can follow each other's national news. So it's fair for us to argue that China and the United States have different media systems and different roles for the media. But it must be said that the mainstream Chinese media is the main channel to help the Chinese people understand the world in general and the US in particular. They introduce the outside world to the Chinese society, and the Chinese society as a whole is friendly to the West, to the United States, willing to learn from the latter, which to a large extent, I think can be attributed to the Chinese media, to the role played by the Chinese media. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about why interactions are that important. The normal exchange came to a halt when Trump administration actually labeled the Chinese media as foreign agents and foreign missions. I think this actually has seriously affected the daily work of the Chinese media, with 60 Chinese journalists being expelled from the country. In response, Chinese had to ask some American journalists leave the country for the sake of this kind of, the principle of reciprocity. After that, the two sides actually fall into the trap of a spiral of escalation of this kind of, contention. That's the reason why a lot of media actually hype this kind of a media warfare between the two countries. This also created a lot of difficulties in improving mutual understanding between China and the United States. To prove that, actually, I just want to quote from two Pew Research Center surveys. One is done in the year 2013. It found that about 74% of the Chinese believe bilateral relations had improved in the previous year, while a similar survey conducted before 2020 US general election found that about 75, roughly the same percentage actually of the Chinese believe bilateral relations had deteriorated compared to with the previous year. In order to resolve this, I think thanks to the great wisdom of the top leaderships of the two countries, before the summit meeting in 2021, 3 mutual understandings had been reached between the two sides, of which the core is still the principle of reciprocity. So from this, we can see that actually media interactions are of great importance to secure a sound relation between China and the United States. And the politicization of media exchanges is not the way forward. I'll just come to a very quick conclusion. So we see, based on what I have heard from the previous presentations of the scholars, we can find that actually China needed US as much as the US needed China. So this kind of I think Professor Wang Dong actually proposed that the G2 structure, and we hope that we can further promote media interactions so that the media can focus more on issues where the United States and China can work together to show the public that the two countries are actually working together. So that I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhang, for letting us, or for leading us through the diachronical development of media interaction and also the current situation. Thank you so much. And now, Dr. Kapp, I think it's your turn. Thank you.
Believe it or not, I'm still going to ask you to wait another minute. I understand from Madeline that Mike Lampton wants to have a word. Mike, is that so? Oh, unmute yourself, Mike. Do you want to, Mike?
No, not really, but I would just comment that we are talking about the Nixon-Mao model of our relations. And what I would just say is, in a way, the model of our relations changed. Particularly, I would talk about the President Carter Deng Xiaoping model, which really moved us from leaders to society relationship. So I don't want us just to sign on to the idea, if our leaders don't reach a big strategic understanding, there's no room for progress, because I think we are still, importantly, a society-to-society relationship. But I don't want to intrude. I want to hear from you, Bob.
All right, I guess I'm cornered now and can't avoid further evasion. So let me just offer a couple of comments. There's been a great deal to think about in this whole meeting. And so my comments are in a sense, they almost predated the conference itself. Just a few. First of all, I want to thank everybody who's taken part, and in particular, the many people both in the United States and a couple even in China, whom I personally recruited to be part of this. It means a lot to me to be able to draw some of my friends and long-term acquaintances and colleagues back into a discussion like this. Thank you very much. I tend to talk bluntly. I've even talked bluntly on occasion to Chinese leaders, so I guess I'll be brave enough to talk bluntly here. We're right that we need to try not to let ideology determine every aspect of the US-China relationship in practical terms. But no, I'm sorry, let me come to another point first. It's very important in dialogues like this for people from each country to speak not only about the other country that they study, but about their own countries. Now, I could go on at length about the United States, and none of us wants to, as we say in American English, air our dirty laundry in public. Some of you have been watching what has been transpiring in Washington, D.C. in recent days. I certainly have. America has many conflicts and political, intense political dialogues going on here, which are of pressing concern. But what I'm trying to get at is, as I think Jia Daojun, for one, made clear, it's very important when we talk to each other that we talk even about our own countries to the other side, as well as about what we see in the other country. And that has happened at some points in this meeting, and it has not happened at other points in this meeting. And I encourage that we go forward in that sense in the future. Take, for example, the matter of reciprocity, just in passing, picking up on Ranji Jun's comments of just a second ago. The reciprocity thing has also to do, of course, with the policies that the Chinese government has always implemented with regard to foreign journalists in China in terms of access and travel and all sorts of other things. So it is important when we're seeing, as Zhou Qi did at such with such thoroughness, it's important to recognize that there are things within one's own society, even if they are not conveniently talked about in many environments. It's important to recognize in dialogue with the person from the other society that one's own society has some issues that are of relevance to the dialogue. Now, I happen to hit on Sun Ji-sheng's comment about the same words meaning different things. Long ago, at the beginning of all of this US-China relations work that I got involved in after I left academia at the beginning of the 1980s, I realized that it's one thing to translate hydrogen sulfide or potassium chloride from English into Chinese. And it's another thing to start translating the terms of social affairs, of government policy, of labor, of economics. And Sun Ji-sheng is absolutely right on that. And it's something that can never be fully resolved, but it has to be constantly pursued. We have to make sure when we use terms that the other side understands the terms the way we intend them to be understood. It's a very long, slow process, and it can never be ended. And younger generations need to learn how to do it, just as people like Mike Lampton and Cha Dao-jung and so many of us on this call have learned over the years. But I can't emphasize it enough, even though it's a very abstract concept and not a cure for any particular problem in the US-China relationship today. The last point is the one I started with and then decided to put last. Yes, infusing ideology into every aspect of US-China relations is a recipe for unsolved problems and even for conflict. But please, everybody, let's not pretend that the Americans are the only ones who are infusing ideology. I mean, have we not heard of the thought of the leader in China? I mean, what could be more, forgive me, but what could be more ideological than the thoughts of the holder of profound temporal leadership power in China? So again, we come back to the idea that yes, the removing of ideology from its kind of blocking role in every aspect of American-Chinese interaction would be a great thing to do. Let's get started. But I ask my friends in China, how do we begin? Now, I'm sure we're out of time. We're nearly out of time, and I don't want to go back through my endless notes here to pick up on all the arrows that I marked as we went through. I think Steve Roach's concept of a secretariat is a very interesting one. But if you think about how it would be staffed on both sides, we'd have to ask ourselves whether that presumably apolitical and de-ideologized secretariat of experts could somehow be insulated from the very forces that Steve and the rest of us are so unhappy with today. I mean, think of the elites that would scramble to participate in that in the United States. They're the same elites that we've known all along, and I think perhaps the same thing might be true in China. So, Steve, we need to dialogue further on that. I think it's a lovely idea to pursue, and I hope we can go further with it. Last point, and then I will stop, and these are all of a piece. As you can see, I have no notes. The encouraging thing about this call, about this conference or this webinar, is something that I think it was Dao-jung, but perhaps it was somebody else made clear. We're at a point now where too many Americans fall into the idea that it's sort of like the 1950s idea all over again. Back in the 1950s, in the days when the US and China were completely at odds with each other and out of contact with each other, there was a myth in the United States that the vast population of China was an army of, and I mean this, I quote this exactly, blue ants. 蓝色的蚂蚁, you might say. That is to say, everybody wore blue clothing because in those days, everybody wore blue cotton clothing. But moreover, everyone was indistinguishable from everybody else. it was just this undifferentiated mass of people of the same color clothing and the same, implicitly the same behavior, the same thinking, and so forth and so on. It's a horrible vision. This conference has restored my faith in the fact that China, like the United States, is a country of vast complexity, whose people and whose intellectually trained elites represent a variety of different and sometimes even conflicting views. And to me, that's a sign of great hope. It's a message that has to be repeated and drilled in over and over again. If by any chance, and I can't imagine that it's true, people in China think that the Americans are an army of ants who all think the same, it's just not possible. I mean, you know us too well for that. We clearly do not all think the same things, but it's important that both sides recognize that there is and must be room for intellectual difference and even for political difference, at least in the case of this country, and for differences of fundamental outlook within the populations of both countries. That would be a step toward a better relationship between the United States and China in the long-term future. I've spoken too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kapp. I think that's a very good remark and also a very good conclusion. Actually, we have like 3 minutes before, before time to stop. I saw one question from the Q&A session. I would rather like to change this question a little bit, combined with what is mentioned by Professor Sun, Professor Zhang, and some of our speakers about discourse. Professor Sun mentioned discursive gap between these two countries, and also Professor Zhang mentioned the role of mass media. Actually, this question is, I think, basically to use a modern Chinese wording, is to tell good Chinese stories. So basically it's about what can you tell people in the US and probably in the world that China's prosperity would not increase the tension, bilateral tension. I think maybe we can just deal with this question for a little bit before we end this session.
If I may, although I'm not on this particular panel, here in China, we must understand it's not the Chinese prosperity or progress that's understood as a quote-unquote threat. It's rather whether or not China's market access or the ways of doing things, and indeed, as we speak, how we treat our own citizens. I'm not talking about Xinjiang or Tibetan minorities. I'm talking about how the Chinese public health authorities handle the quarantine. It's, people like to look for similarities. We get scared. I mean, foreigners, when they call China a threat, a lot of times that sense of China being, let's say, absurd or different from us comes from how different Chinese governments treat their own people. But luckily, we do have positive developments in China as well, although that eludes the press. For instance, nowadays there is far faster and a more profound denunciation of injustice, of the lack of justice by police treatment abuse. So build a society that's more similar rather than being abstract. Abstracting this to, wow, oh, okay, this just these foreigners who are jealous about China. That's just, we got, so rich so fast. But yeah, your economy grew, but how did you grow it? It's very much like look at our neighbor. A neighbor can grow fast, but if the neighbor robs a bank, that kind of wealth is not some sort of wealth to celebrate, although that analogy may not apply squarely to China.
Thank you very much, Professor Jia. So I think it's time to wrap up. It's already 10:50. So at last, I want to thank all these 5 speakers in this session for their insightful ideas. And also, I would like to wrap up this session by, I think we're talking about since Nixon's visit to China. So I would like to wrap up this session by quoting Nixon in his toast, in which actually quoted Chairman Mao. I think we're all familiar with these lines. So many deeds cry out to be done, and always urgently. The world rolls on, time presses, 10,000 years are too long, seize the day, seize the hour. So let's all seize every opportunity to promote the bilateral relations between these two great nations. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Vice President Sun, if you want to turn your camera on.
We now have closing remarks from the two hosts.
So I will go first, or Ambassador Block?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, all right. Yeah, thank you all. Thank you very much. Actually, the theme of this conference is Nixon China plus 50. I think through 2 half-days discussion, we have had very interesting and very inspiring discussion regarding the past 50 years, the development of the bilateral relations between China and the US. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all the participants, speakers, moderators, discussants, and commentators. So you all have provided very thoughtful, very thought-provoking ideas and thoughts regarding China-US relations. And during our discussion, we all agree that China-US relations is extremely important, not only for the two countries, but also for the rest of the world. Besides, we all agree that now we are faced with challenges and difficulties, and we all need to think about how to push the bilateral relations forward, so as to guarantee it is stable, it moves forward, and it helps to solve, even global issues faced with the whole world. So this is a very, actually very productive, webinar for all of us. Actually, this is also a great learning process, a great thinking process for all of us. So I thank all the participants and also, the audience online to ask questions and to make the speakers to think further. The second point, I would also like to thank USAID, especially Ambassador Julie Chang-Block, to give us the opportunity to trust China Foreign Affairs University for us to co-host this event. But it's really a shame, it's a pity that we can only organize this conference online. Also, I know we have prepared it for quite a while, but finally we made it. At least we can have some candid and very frank discussion online. So it's better than none. So we look forward to have more discussion and more communication with our colleagues, both in China and in the US. I think all of us, for instance, for all the Chinese scholars present today, we have all been to the States many times, and some even studied or lived there for quite a while. So we all hope that China-US relations can develop further, can move forward, not only for the benefits of the two countries, but also for the whole world, because the world is watching us, watching the two countries closely. So I really thank Ambassador Block for the trust and for our joint efforts to organize this event. And we look forward to more cooperation with USAID in the future. with Ambassador Block and with President Ross. So I hope in the future we can either go to the US or invite you to come to CFAU again, so that we can have more communication. We can do more things for the development of people-to-people exchanges between the two sides. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you again.
And thank you, Professor Sun, or Vice President Sun. This is an important moment, the conclusion of our first American Studies Network conference in 3 years. I think you will all agree that this has been a rare and precious opportunity to gather an outstanding group of scholars from the US and China. I want, of course, to add my thanks to Vice President Sun. But it's really a personal pleasure for me and a very nostalgic moment for me to see so many old friends. In particular, I want to note 4 young scholars who have now joined, I think, the ranks of wise men. And I'm talking about you, Wang Dong. You should show yourself. And Da Wei, Wang Yong, and Xie Tao. You were all students or PhD students or very young scholars when I first met you. And I should really add Li Wei into this group, because while we have not worked together, Li Wei, our paths have crossed many times at Fudan and Beidao. There is hope if we have this new generation. Now I would like to applaud our speakers today and last night for avoiding the pitfalls of the false narratives that have been referred to by many speakers. To give us this, as Vice President Sun mentioned, candid and wide-ranging discussion. Special thanks, of course, to China Foreign Affairs University, to Vice President Sun Ji-sen particularly, whose call for improved communication and language I fully support, to the Dean Si and Dean Ran Qijun for all their work on bringing this meeting to fruition. See, I still remember our conversation back in 2018 at the ASN conference hosted by East China Normal University, where we came up with the idea for this conference. And little did we know it would take us 4 years, actually. Well, persistence pays off. Thanks to all of you, to our distinguished speakers, as well as to our audience who have joined from around the world, and my appreciation to the USET team for all the hard work in finally putting this program together, despite the postponements due to COVID. The tensions that have built up between the United States and China have been extensively discussed here. But this was an effort, this meeting was an effort to step back and put them into a larger context of the last 50 years. We have reviewed highs and lows of US-China relations since the 70s and look forward also to thinking about what the future may hold. The tenor of our meeting has been somewhat pessimistic, but again, there is hope in the discussion, in the candor, in the recommendations that have come out from our discussions. We will keep a record of these important comments, exchanges, and we plan to share video highlights on the USET website and on our social media accounts. We will also compile a summary report of this webinar and make it available in July. I am happy to report that more than 325 people registered for this conference. Last night's session had 283 hits, and many in the audience joined from their links using 2 devices, meaning they forwarded to others. I hope at least one ASN member university in attendance will volunteer to host next year's ASN conference. We can't let this stop. 24 American universities and 26 Chinese universities were represented at these discussions. 8 of the universities are not yet ASN members, and you know who you are. If only 6 of you joined, we can celebrate our 20th anniversary in 2024 at next year's ASN conference with 60 members instead of 54. Of course, 62 would be better, even better. We will try our best, if conditions permit, to more actively engage with American Studies Network in person in 2023, inshallah. Finally, I hope, if nothing else, these 2 sessions of our first virtual ASN conference will inspire us all to try and meet in person in China next year. We will adapt, if necessary, to hybrid formats to reach the largest possible audience. But it is critical to keep these exchanges going now more than ever. We must keep our channels of communication open, keep our conferences going, and continue the ASN dialogue we restarted here. Only by staying engaged can we avoid serious misunderstandings, find common ground, and keep the world at peace and our families and children safe. So thank you all. And this concludes our conference. Thank you.
Thank you.